our next guest.
We do. We have Blythe Brumlove. She is with Cyberly, the Cyberly host. Blythe, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. It's a busy week in my world. I'm sure for a lot of other folks that work at FreightWaves. But I got the added edition of the Kentucky Derby, which is essentially a family reunion. Every single year is the first one that we've had back since 2019. So super excited for that. But then the very next morning, I am flying out to go to FreightWaves Future of Supply Chain. So busy week, but fun week.
We can't wait to see you out there. That'll be awesome. Now, you mentioned the race. Oh, yes, I know. So you mentioned the race, and we're going to get into the logistics a bit of it when it comes to racehorses. What can you tell us?
Okay, so I did this story last year, and it was just amazing to sort of, run it, because I mentioned earlier about how, my family is super dedicated to the Kentucky Derby every year. We have half of our family is all from Louisville, Kentucky. The other half is located in Jacksonville, Florida. But a lot of when I was doing research on how horses are being transported, I just assumed, like a lot of people, that it was just done through through the road, over the road transport. But come to find out that there are actually these premium jets. There's a plane called Air Horse One that's created by Tex Sutton. They trademarked the name. They put it on all of their branding, and they had these specialized planes that fly these pricey derby horses, not just derby horses, but these thoroughbreds all across the globe in these different conditions, depending on the horse's temperament. It was just really rad to sort of go through and see how different level of horses based on their comfort level are transported either through ground or through air. A lot of these are just specialized carriers, super niche carriers, and it also investigating their not investigating, but kind of investigating their social media and seeing how they market their own sort of transportation services just specifically for horses. So Tex Sutton was one of them. And then there was another one that I'm blanking on their name right now. But it was just a really fascinating sort of deep dive. And as I was going into the research phase, I also discovered that there was a National Association of Horse Carriers, which is the association that determines the rules and regulations for how horses are transported all over the globe. And this was established in like the 50s or the early 60s. But come to find out, because my family is so large, that one of my great uncles was actually a founding member of this association for horse carriers. So it was sort of a neat discovery, being so closely tied to the event. It's the Super Bowl of horse racing. It's one, the first leg of the Triple Crown, arguably the most popular of all the horse races. So I know there may not be a particularly large audience of horse racing fans out there, but it was a super exciting story to sort of dive into. It's available over on FreightWaves TV if anybody wants to catch it out, more of like a deep dive into it. But that was sort of my awakening. And so we're extra excited this year with the Derby officially being back in May with the full hats, the culture, the drinks, the mint juleps, the big dresses, the big hats, everything. We're super excited to all have it back in place.
Blythe, this does sound like a super exciting time for sure.
I was going to say, I just feel like it's so interesting. I can't even get my dog on a domestic flight. They can get these racehorses up there. My goodness.
Yeah, I mean, the logistics of that is impressive.
And I was going to say that, like, some of the horses, you have to test their temperament to see if they're okay with flying by themselves or if they have to have a buddy horse that like flies with them. So it was really cute how they approach that. Not only that, but with the weather. So the pilots will specifically avoid rough weather patterns in order to keep the horses as comfortable as possible. So it's sort of a unique situation when you think about shipping. You typically think about, commodity type goods, but, these expensive, sometimes $1 million horses that have to travel, people want to make sure that their horses are protected and that, they're ready for that investment of seeing if they can win, a Kentucky Derby or a Preakness or a Belmont, which can then result in enormous amounts of stud fees that you charge later on. So it's a whole economy.
And Blythe, when we're looking at these horses coming in, do you know if there's any kind of like lead time for these horses to touch ground and get acclimated? I don't know if horses go through jet lag potentially, or is there any of those factors that kind of go into play as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the logistics of that is impressive. And
It really depends on the horse itself. So a lot of these horses have already been in Louisville, Kentucky for about the last week, some of them longer. But it really sort of, with the onslaught of people coming on to Churchill Downs this weekend, sometimes these trainers will take their horses out when there's no media because they don't want them to get spooked. It really depends on the horse's sort of temperament. There was a few years ago, American Pharoah was one of the big horses that won the Triple Crown a few years ago. That was a completely different horse where it had a big personality. It loved to be around people. So it really just kind of depends, like jet lag wise, personality wise, on when you choose to make your horse arrive at the Churchill Downs, and then also how you train them and when at certain times of when you bring the horse around. Because like I said, they could just sort of hate people and just want to race. And yes, horses legitimately want to race. They want to beat the next horse beside them. There's all different kinds of personality levels, much like a dog. It's really sort of interesting to watch how much money and time and attention that is put on a horse that's 2 or 3 years old.
Now, just to switch gears a little bit, I know there's going to be a plethora of influencers, of course, at the Kentucky Derby, taking advantage of everything that's happening there. But let's kind of get into maybe that influencer marketing, maybe how some businesses are taking advantage of it or why they should be taking advantage of it.
Yeah, so influencer marketing is something that has really been around. And I think when you say it, people feel like it's just like an icky word, but it's something that's always been around, whether it's, political leaders or celebrities or any sort of high status person. They influence your purchasing decisions. And what we've sort of seen over the last couple of years, especially since COVID, is this rise of the digital influencer, especially among the office workers, I should say, within freight. Drivers, on the other hand, have had a huge social media presence for years and years. They have the best, hands down, social media presence on a variety of channels, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, all of these different platforms where they have hundreds of thousands of followers sometimes because that's their community. So they've been creating content online for years. And so we're slowly starting to see this shift into more niche focused influencer marketing. And I think that that's a huge opportunity for some of these companies out here. If you're having trouble retaining drivers, if you're having trouble recruiting drivers, starting to use more user generated content, which is the content that other people put out into online, and how you use it and how you approach a relationship to use that content with that driver or with that influencer. And so it's really starting to take hold. And I came across this stat earlier in the week that said user generated content accounts for 39% of the weekly media hours consumed by Americans. So it's a huge opportunity for folks who are facing recruiting challenges, who are facing, these challenges of trying to get new customers, and how you're using social media. And one of those things that you could be doing, especially if you don't want to be on camera, is to use the folks and work with folks that do love to be on camera. So I think it's a really exciting time. So we're going to dive into more of those tips on how to work with influencers from a company perspective in tomorrow's episode of Cyberly.
And Blythe, would this sometimes potentially be a double-edged sword? So potentially being able to work with some of those influencers, but also some influencers could probably give you a bad rating or a bad rep. Is that also another potential possibility there?
Oh, for sure. There's always, sort of a little bit of a danger whenever you're picking folks who don't necessarily work for you. These could be company drivers. These could be owner operators. But I think having a good glance of the content that they're already making is a perfect use case, because then you can look at everything that they produce maybe over the last few years and see if they're touching on things that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable, that maybe you don't want to necessarily promote as a brand, because even though you might not pick that particular video, and maybe it's a political opinion, for example, and you don't necessarily want that on your social media feeds, but they have a really great recruiting video or a training video of what they, went through driving school for. There's a kind of a balance that you have to take, and there is a certain amount of risk, but as long as you're doing that pre-qualifying ahead of time, the good news with social media is that you have the exact resume of what you're looking for. You can look at that right publicly on their profile, and you can also see the content that's performed well. What kind of comments are they getting? What kind of engagement are they getting? And then you can kind of filter out and make sort of that Venn diagram of the drivers and the end goal of the content that you want to achieve. And then in what drivers, either your own drivers or your own employees, or somewhere in the sphere of the industry, what kind of content are they making that's already performing well, and can that match with your goals without causing like a PR backlash? So it's a good sort of Venn diagram of way of looking at it.
Now, Blythe, you mentioned just a little bit earlier that you've got your Cyberly show tomorrow, but tell us more. Where can folks find you and hear more about these topics?
Sure. So every Thursday, 2 p.m., we're actually covering, since I covered the logistics of racehorses last year, tomorrow is Cinco de Mayo. So I'm going to be covering the logistics of tequila, along with a few other guests that are going to be joining the show. So it's going to be a jam-packed show. And then we're going to be ready to fly out to Rogers to take place for the FreightWaves conference. So it's a busy week, but every Thursday, 2 p.m., Cyberly is live.
Awesome, Blythe. We're looking forward to it. And thank you so much for joining us this morning. Real quick, before we let you go, who's winning the Kentucky Derby?
I'm going to go with Messier because he's a Bob Baffert horse. Bob Baffert is not really allowed at the Kentucky grounds right now because he's going through a little bit of trouble. But the horse is still trained by him. So I'm going Messier for my winner.
Awesome, Blythe. Thank you so much. Looking forward to it. And we'll catch up with you again shortly.